Welcome to Watercolor Exercise 2. In this video, you're going to practice a couple more techniques using the large mop brush. And the techniques that we're going to cover are wet and wet, lifting and blotting, and probably something else too, maybe dry brush as well. But first we're going to use the mop brush, which is a large brush, and it's usually primarily used without color, and it's used to lay down a large amount of water on the paper to pre-wet it. And so this is where the wet and wet method comes in. And so I'm going to be using the mop brush first with some clean water, and then a smaller brush with the color. And if you want to test out, before you do this on the big paper, if you want to test it out on a smaller sheet to see how it works, you could do that. For the paper today, I'm using a more heavyweight paper, and I've got it taped down to the board on all four sides, and this will help keep the paper from buckling from the amount of water that we're going to put on it, which is quite a lot. So I'm going to start just by wetting. I'm going to soak one side of the page with the mop brush, and you just spread the water on the page, and I'm going to do about half of it, partially because it's easier to control a smaller area, and the other reason is because with wet and wet, where you soak the paper is only where the color is going to go. The water will act as kind of a barrier. So I can do one color on one side of the paper and another color on another side of the paper. Or if I'm working in more complicated areas, I can separate the paper into smaller zones or separate shapes using just the water. Like I said, wherever the water goes, the color will stay. So now, when I spread the pigment on the paper, I've already got this wet surface, and you can see that a gradient. It's really easy to make that gradient. So the gradient that we created in exercise 1, where you were adding more water from the brush, is a little bit more laborious than it is here, because here the water does the work for you because the paper's already wet. You can add to this wet and wet area so long as the paper's still wet. Once the paint starts to dry, if you go back and you add more, you might get what are called blooms, where the new area will spread into the old area, and it makes these kind of ugly barriers. So try to do all your painting in sort of one go before it dries, or before it starts to dry. I've got a bit of a sharp edge over here, so I can just use I can use just a clean brush to sort of sweep that away. And I don't have a paper towel, but I would really like a paper towel right here. I'm just going to use my hand and just clean that edge up like that. So, all right, that's one side. So let's do the other side. And it's a good idea to change out your water when you're doing this, so that your colors don't interfere. I mean, unless you're okay with that. All right, rinse out the brush. Now, get this other color. Actually, maybe I'll mix these. That yellow is going to be hard to see. I'll do an orange this time. The other nice thing about wet and wet is that you don't really need a lot of pigment for this, because the paper's already so soaked that it really spreads the pigment really easily. Okay, and you can then combine colors within your gradient. So now I've got a 1-color gradient on this side, and I've got a 2-color gradient on this side. I've got a hair in there. Let's get that out of there. All right, and you could even do 3 or 4-color gradients within your wet and wet zone if you want to. All right, so that is the first technique. That's the wet and wet. And then I'm going to wait for this to dry, and then I'll come back and do the lifting and blotting, a little bit more wet and wet, and then maybe I'll throw a dry brush in there too.